The wind howls across a barren plain where a mighty empire once stood. We think of dust bowls as a modern disaster, but ancient civilizations faced them too, with far more devastating consequences. An ancient dust bowl was a perfect storm of prolonged drought, relentless soil erosion, and the slow creep of desertification. These events did not just cause a few bad harvests. They shattered entire worlds, toppling kingdoms and erasing golden ages from memory. By the end of this journey, you will know the 30 ancient dust bowls that secretly shaped our world. Why did the great city of Ankara, with its ingenious water system, vanish into the jungle? What force could make the powerful Hittite Empire abandon its capital overnight? How much of our own future is written in this ancient dust? The first of these great collapses echoes from a time before even Rome or Greece existed. Around 4,200 years ago, the Akkadian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Its founder, Sargon of Akkad, had forged this colossal realm, the first true empire in history. It was a powerhouse of administration and culture, seemingly unshakable. Then the rain stopped. For decades, then for centuries, the skies withheld their life-giving water. We know this not just from fragmented clay tablets, but from the silent testimony of the earth itself. Scientists drilling deep into the seabed of the Gulf of Oman have pulled up mud cores that tell a stark story. Within those layers, they found a sudden, massive influx of wind-blown dust, particles that could only have come from the plains of Mesopotamia. This was not a single sandstorm. It was the geological signature of a centuries-long drought, a period so arid and harsh it has been named the Long Drought. The very agricultural heartland that fed the Akkadian cities and armies simply turned to dust. Canals silted up, fields cracked under a relentless sun, and grain stores emptied. Famine spread like a plague through the empire. The social contract, the very glue that held the empire together, shattered. People abandoned the great cities, fleeing in desperation. Without food and water, the emperor's authority meant nothing. The empire fragmented back into the warring city-states from which it had risen, leaving its grand palaces to be buried by the very dust that had defeated it. The Akkadian collapse was a terrifying first. It was the first time a climate event, a prolonged and merciless dust bowl, was documented as the direct cause of an empire's fall. It set a grim and enduring precedent, a warning written not on stone but in ancient dust. While the Akkadian Empire crumbled under a dusty sky, another cataclysm was unfolding along the banks of the Nile. In Egypt, the era we call the Old Kingdom was the age of the pyramid builders, a time of unimaginable prosperity and power for the pharaohs. These rulers were considered living gods, and they demonstrated their divine authority by constructing the most massive stone structures the world had ever seen. The Great Pyramid of Giza was already centuries old, a permanent testament to a civilization at its zenith. But this golden age was about to come to a sudden and horrifying end. Around 2180 before the Common Era, the predictable, life-giving rhythm of the Nile failed. The annual flood, which deposited rich, fertile silt across the farmlands, dwindled to a trickle. For years, the river did not rise to its necessary level. The evidence for this disaster is etched in stone, not as a boast of a pharaoh's power, but as a desperate confession of societal collapse. Tomb inscriptions from this period describe a world turned upside down. One official named Anktifi recorded the stark reality, stating, "All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger to such a degree that everyone had come to eating their children." The land was ravaged by famine so severe that unthinkable acts became commonplace. The very fabric of Egyptian society, which depended entirely on the Nile's bounty, unraveled completely. This was not merely a local drought. Modern climate science points to a global phenomenon, the same shifting weather patterns that starved the Akkadians. A period of intense aridity, fueled by dust-laden winds and a failure of rains at the Nile's distant sources, strangled Egypt. The pharaoh, once an infallible god-king, was now seen as powerless to command the heavens. His divine mandate was broken. The central government in Memphis collapsed, and for over a century, Egypt splintered into a collection of warring provinces, a dark era historians call the First Intermediate Period. The dust that settled over the Nile Valley did not just bury fields. It buried an entire concept of kingship, proving that not even a god on earth could hold back the desert when the climate itself turned against him. Far to the east of Egypt, another sophisticated society was facing its own slow-burning environmental crisis. The Indus Valley civilization, with its meticulously planned cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, thrived on a foundation of predictable monsoon rains and mighty flowing rivers. Their streets were laid out in perfect grids, they had advanced drainage systems, and they engaged in trade across vast distances. But around 1900, before the Common Era, this remarkable stability began to fracture. The monsoons, the lifeblood of the entire region, began to fail. They became weaker, less reliable, and shifted their course. The great rivers that watered their fields, perhaps the legendary Saraswati among them, started to shrink or change their paths entirely. The rich agricultural land, once so productive, began to dry up and turn to dust. This was not a sudden collapse, but a long, agonizing dispersal. As the dust gathered on their streets and their grain stores dwindled, the people of the Indus Valley did not wait for a dramatic end. They made a practical, heartbreaking decision. They abandoned their magnificent, orderly cities block by block, migrating slowly eastward and southward in search of reliable water. Their civilization did not fall in a fiery conquest. It simply faded away, its people scattering into smaller, rural villages, leaving their grand urban centers to be silently reclaimed by the encroaching sand. While the Indus Valley was succumbing to a prolonged drought, a cataclysm of an entirely different kind was brewing in the heart of the Mediterranean. Around 1600 before the Common Era, the volcanic island of Thera, now known as Santorini, exploded with a force unmatched in human history. The eruption was apocalyptic, sending colossal amounts of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere. This debris did not simply fall back to the sea. It formed a vast global veil that drifted across the world, blocking sunlight and dramatically cooling the planet. This phenomenon, known as a volcanic winter, descended upon the vibrant Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. The skies darkened for years and temperatures plummeted. The resulting dust-laden haze and acid rain led to widespread crop failures and famine. The Minoans, a seafaring power known for their beautiful palaces and vibrant culture, were severely weakened. Their fleet, the source of their wealth and power, was likely devastated by the tsunamis that followed the initial eruption. Crippled by hunger and environmental chaos, they were left vulnerable. In their weakened state, they could not resist the rising power of the mainland Mycenaeans, who moved in to fill the power vacuum. The ash from Thera did not just bury a single city, it cast a long shadow that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the ancient world, demonstrating how a single geological event could create a dust-filled atmospheric winter capable of toppling a maritime empire. The shadow of Thera had long faded, but a new and even more pervasive threat was gathering over the Bronze Age world. The grand citadels of the Mycenaeans, with their famous Lion Gate and sprawling palace complexes, stood as symbols of a warrior culture grown rich on Mediterranean trade. Theirs was a society of opulent tombs, intricate bureaucracy, and far-reaching connections. Yet, by 1100 before the Common Era, every single one of their great centers was burned, abandoned, or left in ruins. For decades, historians pointed to mysterious invaders known only as the Sea Peoples as the likely culprits. But the real story is written not in ancient battle accounts, but in the mud at the bottom of the sea. Core samples drilled from the seabed between Greece and Turkey tell a terrifying story of a climate gone horribly wrong. These sediment layers reveal a period of intense, prolonged drought and wild temperature swings that gripped the eastern Mediterranean for nearly 300 years. Imagine the fertile plains of Greece, the very breadbaskets that fed the populous cities, slowly baking under a relentless sun. The soil dried to dust and the winds carried it away, creating the very conditions of an ancient dust bowl. This was not a single bad season. It was a systemic, multi-generational failure of the environment. The Mycenaean economy was a delicate house of cards built on agriculture and international trade. Their palaces functioned as central banks, collecting grain, olive oil, and pottery to be traded across the sea for vital resources like copper, tin, and luxury goods. When the dust settled on their barren fields, that entire system imploded. No surplus meant nothing to trade. With nothing to trade, the intricate networks that stretched from Italy to Egypt shattered. Famine sparked internal rebellions as desperate people turned on the ruling class that could no longer feed them. The grand palaces, from Pylos to Mycenae itself, were not just conquered by outside forces, they were consumed from within by fire and chaos before being left to the encroaching earth. The sea peoples were likely not a cause, but a symptom of this wider collapse, a wave of refugees and raiders themselves fleeing similar environmental disasters elsewhere. The true end of the Mycenaeans was a slow, suffocating death by dust and drought, plunging Greece into a dark age that would last for centuries, its written language forgotten and its glorious past fading into myth. The Assyrian Empire was a colossus of iron and terror, an unstoppable war machine that had dominated the ancient Near East for centuries. Its heart beat in the fertile plains of northern Mesopotamia, a land of abundant grain that fed its vast professional armies. From this agricultural powerhouse, the Assyrian kings launched campaign after campaign, their power seemingly absolute. Yet this invincible giant was about to meet an enemy its legions could not defeat. Far from the battlefields, in the quiet depths of lakes in Iran and Turkey, a hidden record was being written. Sediment cores pulled from these lakebeds reveal a stark truth. Layer by layer, they tell the story of a mega-drought that gripped the region throughout the 7th century before the Common Era, a prolonged dry spell of breathtaking severity. This was not a few years of poor rains. This was a climatic shift that lasted for generations, turning the empire's breadbasket to dust. Imagine the relentless sun baking the very fields that supplied the imperial granaries. Picture the constant, dust-laden wind scouring the topsoil, leaving behind cracked earth and failed harvests. How does any empire, no matter how militarily powerful, sustain itself when its fundamental resource base vanishes? The Assyrian state, built on conquest and tribute, began to starve from the inside out. Its legendary army, still formidable, found its supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Famine bred discontent in the provinces, and the empire's vast structure grew brittle. This internal weakness did not go unnoticed. The Babylonians to the south and the Medes from the Iranian plateau, long subjugated by Assyria, saw their chance. Forged into a powerful coalition, they moved against the crippled giant. The drought had done their work for them, hollowing out their enemy before the first sword was even drawn. The final blow fell on the magnificent capital, Nineveh. After a brutal siege in 612 before the Common Era, the city was sacked and burned so completely that its very location would be forgotten for millennia. The fall of Nineveh was not just a military defeat. It was the dramatic, fiery end of an empire suffocated by dust, a testament to the fact that no amount of human strength can ultimately prevail when the land itself turns against you. Even the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, may have been a desperate response to a creeping threat. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which rose from the ashes of Assyria, was a dazzling spectacle of wealth and architectural genius. Its lifeblood was the Euphrates River, a twisting vein of water snaking through an otherwise arid landscape. The entire empire was a monument to hydraulic engineering, a vast, intricate web of canals, dikes, and reservoirs designed to coax life from the river and push back the ever-present desert. This artificial paradise, however, created a profound and fatal dependency. The empire's stability was a delicate balance, entirely reliant on the consistent flow and quality of the Euphrates. And that flow was not entirely under their control. Far upstream, in the highlands of Anatolia and Syria, the same climatic pressures that had felled the Assyrians were still at work. Periods of intense drought and poor land management in those distant regions would send massive quantities of loose, dry soil into the river. The Euphrates would then carry this sediment downstream like a slow-moving avalanche. For Babylon, this meant catastrophe. Their magnificent canals, the very arteries of the state, would gradually clog with silt. At the same time, dust storms born from those same parched uplands would sweep across the plains, depositing yet more fine sediment into the waterworks. Maintaining this system required constant, back-breaking labor. When a canal silted up, the fields it watered would wither and die within a single growing season. A series of such events could plunge the empire into food crisis and social unrest, forcing the king to divert immense resources and manpower just to keep the water flowing. This constant environmental battle created a critical vulnerability. The Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, a master strategist, understood this weakness perfectly. When his armies marched on Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, he did not need to storm its legendary walls. Historical accounts suggest he diverted the very river that gave the city life, either lowering its level to allow his troops to wade through the river gates or cutting off its water entirely. Whether the story is literal or symbolic, the underlying truth is stark. The Babylonians, exhausted by their endless fight against silt and dust, were in no state to withstand a sophisticated siege. Their empire, for all its golden splendor, was brittle. It did not so much fall as it was gently pushed, its foundations already softened by the relentless, accumulating dust of an unstable climate. The Persian Empire was a marvel of ancient logistics, a realm of staggering diversity united by a single royal road. From the banks of the Nile to the shores of the Indus, the Achaemenid kings ruled over countless cultures and climates. But this very diversity was also its greatest vulnerability. How does an emperor in the grand palace of Persepolis feed his armies and appease his satraps when the breadbasket provinces are turning to dust? The core of the empire, the lands of Persia and Mesopotamia, were not lush paradises. They were arid zones, perpetually balanced on a knife's edge between fertility and desolation. Recurring droughts were a fact of life, and with them came the dust storms. These were not mere inconveniences. A major storm could choke canals, bury fields under a layer of sterile powder, and contaminate precious water stores with salt and silt. When such an event struck a key agricultural province, the shockwave traveled all the way to the imperial treasury. The system of taxation and tribute, the empire's lifeblood, was thrown into chaos. A province that could not feed itself certainly could not send its required grain and silver to the central authority. Instead of collecting wealth, the great king was now forced to redistribute it, ordering grain shipments from Egypt or Bactria to stave off famine and rebellion in a stricken region. This constant, reactive shuffling of resources placed an immense and invisible strain on the imperial administration. It was a slow, draining battle against an enemy that could not be bribed, threatened, or conquered. The empire's magnificent infrastructure, its roads and relay stations, were now being used not just for conquest but for a desperate internal lifeline. This gradual erosion of central authority and economic resilience created a critical weakness. By the time a young Macedonian king named Alexander crossed into Anatolia, the Persian colossus was already fatigued from its endless, quiet war with the climate. The decisive battles were won by Macedonian spears, but the ground for those victories had been prepared by decades of dust. Across the Indus Valley, another Indian empire would rise and fall by the same fragile relationship with the land. The Mauryan Empire under Emperor Ashoka was a realm of breathtaking scale and moral ambition. After his brutal conquest of Kalinga, Ashoka famously renounced violence, embracing Buddhism and erecting pillars across his domain that preached non-violence and compassionate governance. His reign marked a golden age of prosperity, supported by a vast and sophisticated agricultural system. But this very prosperity contained the seeds of its own destruction. The empire's official manual of statecraft, the Arthashastra, provides a chillingly prescient blueprint. It encouraged aggressive agricultural expansion, advising kings to clear forests for new farmland to increase the royal treasury. This was a deliberate policy of deforestation on a massive scale. The lush woodlands that once held the soil in place and helped regulate the local climate were systematically stripped away. Without the deep roots of trees to anchor it, the rich topsoil was left exposed and vulnerable. When the heavy monsoon rains came, they did not soak into the earth. Instead, they washed the unprotected soil away in great, muddy torrents, silting up rivers and canals in the lowlands. This was not a natural disaster, but a human-made crisis of erosion. The land, once fertile, was being bled of its vitality. This self-inflicted wound was then compounded by the climate. Paleoclimate records from regions like the Thar Desert suggest periods of monsoon failure struck the subcontinent around this time. The combination was devastating. The denuded landscape, robbed of its natural resilience, would have baked under the relentless sun when the rains failed. The winds would have then whipped across these barren expanses, lifting the dry, exposed earth into the air. Localized dust bowl conditions began to stalk the empire's heartland. What good are grand philosophical edicts when the fields can no longer feed the people? The empire's immense tax base, dependent on agricultural surplus, evaporated as the land itself gave out. After Ashoka's death, the great Mauryan Empire did not slowly decline. It shattered with astonishing speed, fragmenting back into a patchwork of smaller states within just 50 years. The moral power of the emperor could not hold back the dust. The empire collapsed not from an external invasion, but from an internal exhaustion of the very earth that sustained it. The Yellow River was the lifeblood of Han China, a swirling, muddy giant that watered the empire's vast wheat and millet fields. But that same mud held a terrible secret, a geological curse born from the lowest plateau. This entire region was composed of fine, wind-blown silt, a powdery soil that was incredibly fertile but also dangerously fragile. To feed a growing population, the Han dynasty launched a massive campaign of deforestation, clearing the plateau's protective tree cover to create more farmland. The consequences were catastrophic. Without roots to hold it together, the lowest soil began to dissolve with every rain. Torrents of this liquid earth poured into the Yellow River, turning it into one of the most silt-laden waterways on the planet. The riverbed began to rise slowly but inexorably, lifted by the constant accumulation of mud. Soon, the river was flowing high above the surrounding plains, confined only by a series of dikes and levees that the imperial government had to build ever higher. This created a suspended river, a disaster waiting to happen. When the inevitable floods came, they were apocalyptic. The river would burst its man-made constraints with unimaginable force, not with clear water, but with a thick, churning slurry of silt that drowned entire counties under a solidifying crust of mud. After the waters receded, they left behind a new kind of desert. The former floodplains, once lush and productive, were now buried under sterile sand and dust, a barren landscape where nothing could grow. Can you envision the horror for a farmer? Your field is not just washed away, it is entombed under a thick, concrete-like layer of hardened mud. These catastrophic course changes happened not just once, but repeatedly over decades, each time creating a new wave of environmental refugees and destroying the agricultural base of the state. The imperial treasury, drained by the endless cycle of disaster relief and dike reconstruction, was pushed to the brink. Famine became a constant specter stalking the land. It was from this cauldron of dust and despair that the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted. This was not a simple peasant uprising. It was a messianic, desperate movement fueled by millions who had lost everything to the river's wrath. Their revolt in 184 before the Common Era shattered the authority of the Han court, triggering decades of civil war. The dynasty, fractured and bankrupted by its long war against the river, finally collapsed, plunging China into the bloody and romanticized era of the Three Kingdoms. The Han did not fall to a foreign army. It was choked to death by the very silt that had once made it great. Rome's legions were conquering the world, but their greatest victory was also their most devastating failure. The vast estates known as latifundia spread across Sicily and North Africa, enormous farms worked by enslaved populations captured in Rome's endless wars. To feed the insatiable appetite of the capital city, these lands were pushed to their absolute limit. The same fields were planted with wheat year after year without rest or rotation until the soil was bled white, its nutrients utterly exhausted. The rich, dark earth that had once been the granary of the Republic turned pale and powdery. When the dry winds swept in from the desert, they found nothing to hold the earth in place. Vast clouds of dust, the very soul of the land itself, began to blow away. The yields plummeted and the breadbasket of Rome began to crack. This created a terrifying dependency. The city of Rome now relied almost entirely on grain shipments from a single external source, the fertile Nile under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. This was a strategic nightmare. Whoever controlled the grain supply from Egypt held the city of Rome by the throat. Into this volatile situation stepped two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They were aristocrats who saw the crisis for what it was, a slow-moving disaster born from environmental decay. They proposed land reforms to break up the massive estates and redistribute public land to landless veterans, a plan to restore the small farmer and, by extension, the health of the soil. But the wealthy senatorial class, whose power and wealth were built on those very latifundia, would not yield. The political battle that followed was brutal. Tiberius was clubbed to death by a mob of senators, his body thrown into the Tiber River. His brother Gaius, continuing the fight, was also killed in a state-sanctioned murder. The dust storms in Africa had ignited a political firestorm in Rome. The Republic, already straining under the weight of its empire, had just witnessed its first major political murders in centuries, all sparked by a fight over degraded land. The precedent was set. From that point on, political violence became a standard tool in Roman politics, a direct path that led to the civil wars and the rise of the emperors. The Republic did not fall in a day. It was slowly starved into submission, its foundations eroded by the dust blowing from its own exhausted fields. Deep in the jungles of Central America, a civilization celebrated for its astronomical genius and majestic pyramids simply walked away from its cities. The classic Maya collapse remains one of history's most haunting enigmas. For centuries, their kingdoms thrived, constructing sprawling urban centers like Tikal and Kapan that were marvels of engineering and art. Then, around the 9th century, the lights went out. The great stone stelae, which recorded the deeds of kings with intricate hieroglyphs, stopped being carved. The grand plazas fell silent. For a long time, scholars speculated about invasion, peasant revolt, or epidemic disease. But the true answer was written not on stone, but at the bottom of lakes and in the depths of caves. Scientists drilling into the sediments of Lake Chichancanab in the Yucatan Peninsula found a stunningly clear record. The layers of mud and calcium sulfate, or gypsum, told an unmistakable story. During the critical decades of the collapse, the gypsum concentration skyrocketed. This happens when a lake evaporates under extreme drought conditions, leaving behind the minerals that were once dissolved in its waters. The data points to a horrifying reality, a series of profound droughts, each one lasting for decades, that gripped the Maya heartland. This was not a single bad period. It was a relentless, multi-generational assault by the climate. Imagine the seasonal bojos, the vast, low-lying wetlands that the Maya relied on for agriculture during the dry season. These areas would have been utterly transformed. Instead of moist, fertile ground for planting maize, they became vast, cracked plains of dust. The wind would have whipped across these barren expanses, creating swirling dust devils where crops once grew. Their intricate system of reservoirs and canals, a masterpiece of water management, would have held only stagnant, dwindling pools. How does a society built on the worship of rain gods and the cultivation of corn survive when the rain simply stops coming for a generation? The result was societal chaos. The divine king's most fundamental duty was to intercede with the gods for rain and a bountiful harvest. When the prayers failed year after year, his spiritual authority evaporated faster than the last drops of water in the palace reservoir. City began to turn against city in desperate wars over the remaining reliable water sources. Inscriptions speak not of grand conquests, but of brutal raids and the capture of rival nobles, signs of a world tearing itself apart over a dwindling resource. The social contract shattered. The peasant farmers who had labored to build the towering pyramids saw no reason to continue feeding a ruling class that could no longer deliver the one thing they needed: water. One by one, the magnificent cities were abandoned. The royal palaces were left to the jungle, the people melting away into the forests in smaller, scattered groups. The collapse was not an event, but a process, a slow, agonizing retreat from grandeur driven by dust and thirst. The silence that followed was so complete that the very memory of how to read their writing was lost for 1,000 years. High on the Andean plateau, the Tiwanaku Empire built a civilization against all odds. Their capital city sat beside the vast, deep blue expanse of Lake Titicaca, at an altitude where the air was thin and the climate harsh. To survive and thrive here, they engineered a masterpiece of agriculture, a system of raised fields known as suka collas. These were not simple plots of land. They were long, wide planting platforms surrounded by canals of water. This ingenious design created its own microclimate. The water in the canals absorbed the heat of the sun during the day, radiating it back at night to protect delicate crops from frost. The nutrient-rich muck dredged from the canals served as a constant natural fertilizer. This system turned the challenging altiplano into a breadbasket, supporting a large urban population and a powerful state that influenced a vast region. But this entire civilization was a bet placed on the consistent presence of water, and then the water began to vanish. Paleoclimatic data from the lake itself reveals a devastating shift. A prolonged drought lasting for generations gripped the region around 1,000 years after the Common Era began. The level of Lake Titicaca dropped dramatically, receding far from its original shores. What was left behind was a new and terrifying landscape. The exposed lakebed, a wide, flat plain of dried mud and mineral salts, became a perfect source for dust storms. The relentless Andean winds now scoured this barren expanse, lifting clouds of fine, alkaline dust into the air. These storms did not just darken the sky. They settled over the intricate network of suka collas, choking the life-giving canals with sediment and coating the crops in a layer of sterile powder. The canals, the very heart of the system, dried up and filled with dust. Without the protective water to regulate temperature, the crops were now vulnerable to killing frosts. The entire agricultural foundation of the empire crumbled within a few generations. How do you feed a city when your brilliant farming technology is rendered useless by a changing climate? The answer is you cannot. The capital city of Tiwanaku was abandoned with startling speed. The people who had mastered this high-altitude world for centuries simply dispersed, migrating away in search of reliable water and arable land. Their empire did not fall to a conqueror. It dissolved, leaving behind silent stone monuments and the ghostly grid of its raised fields, a haunting testament to a civilization that was ultimately defeated by dust from its own dying lake. The stone faces of Angkor Wat gaze serenely over a landscape that was once the world's most sophisticated hydraulic machine. In the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire did not just build temples, they engineered an entire water-based civilization. Their capital, Angkor, was a city sustained by a monumental network of canals, massive reservoirs called barrays, and intricate moats. This system was a masterpiece of foresight, designed to capture the torrential monsoon rains and store the water for the long, dry season. It transformed the region into a year-round agricultural powerhouse, supporting a population of perhaps 750,000 people at its zenith. For centuries, this engineered environment seemed invincible, but its greatest strength would become its ultimate weakness. Recent breakthroughs in archaeology have peeled back the jungle canopy to reveal the empire's final act. Using LiDAR, a technology that maps the ground with laser pulses, scientists have seen the true, sprawling extent of Angkor's water grid. And by analyzing the rings of ancient trees from Vietnam, they have reconstructed a climate horror story. The 14th and 15th centuries were not a time of stable monsoons. Instead, the region was hammered by a devastating 1-2 punch of climatic extremes. First came periods of severe multi-year drought. The massive barrays, some as large as inland seas, would have shrunk to muddy puddles. The intricate canals, deprived of their flow, would have begun to clog with sediment. Then, with cruel timing, the skies would open, delivering monsoon rains of exceptional intensity. These were not life-giving showers, they were deluges. The parched, hardened earth could not absorb such a sudden onslaught. The water would have roared across the landscape, carrying with it immense quantities of silt and soil. Where did all this eroded soil come from? The answer lies in the empire's own success. To support its vast population and to build its magnificent temples, the Khmer had cleared vast tracts of forest in the surrounding hills. The land, once anchored by roots, was now loose and vulnerable. The catastrophic floods would have funneled this slurry directly into the heart of the hydraulic system. The meticulously engineered canals and reservoirs, already weakened by drought, were simply overwhelmed. They filled with silt, becoming shallow, stagnant marshes. The system that was designed to control water was now choking on the very land it was built upon. The reservoirs that once reflected the grandeur of the gods now became breeding grounds for disease and vectors of destruction. In the dry seasons that followed, these silt-choked basins would bake hard under the sun, transforming from mudflats into vast, flat plains of dust. The wind would whip across these new, artificial deserts, carrying fine particles that settled over the remaining fields. The empire's agricultural base, the foundation of its power, was systematically dismantled not by a single enemy, but by a volatile climate and the unintended consequences of its own expansion. The magnificent water management system, a wonder of the ancient world, could not save Angkor. It was ultimately defeated by the mud and dust it was meant to control, leading to the city's slow, inexorable abandonment to the waiting jungle. Across the Atlantic, a great city rose not from stone but from earth. Cahokia, situated near the modern city of St. Louis, was the paramount center of the Mississippian world. At its peak around the year 1100, its population may have reached 10,000, a number that rivaled London at the time. Its skyline was dominated by enormous earthen mounds, the largest of which, Monk's Mound, still stands as the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas. This was a vibrant, complex society with far-flung trade networks and a powerful ruling class. Yet, by the middle of the 14th century, this bustling metropolis was silent, its grand plazas empty. The story of its end is written in the rings of ancient trees. Paleoclimatologists have studied the growth rings of bald cypress trees from the region, and they reveal a terrifying period known as the Great Drought. For most of the 13th century, the rains simply failed. This was not a few dry years, it was a relentless, multi-generational arid spell that gripped the heart of North America. Imagine the lifeblood of Cahokia, the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi and its tributaries where they grew their maize. Under the relentless sun, these fields would have baked hard and cracked open. The soil, devoid of moisture, would have turned to a fine, powdery dust, lifted by the wind into hazy clouds that settled over the great mounds. A single bad harvest could be survived, but what happens when the drought lasts for 50 years? The maize crops, the foundation of their diet and their economy, would have withered in the fields year after year. The social and political structure of Cahokia, likely centered on a chief who guaranteed agricultural abundance through spiritual authority, would have crumbled under the weight of such sustained failure. How could a leader claim a special connection to the forces of nature when the sky remained a relentless, cloudless blue? The people, facing starvation, would have had little choice. They began to leave, family by family, clan by clan, dispersing from the great city to seek more reliable sources of water and food elsewhere. Cahokia did not fall in a war or a sudden catastrophe. It was slowly, methodically abandoned, its power dissolving as its people voted with their feet, leaving the grand earthen pyramids to stand as lonely monuments to a civilization defeated by a changing climate and the dust of its own fields. The same arid forces that toppled settled empires may have forged history's greatest nomadic conquerors. The Mongol Empire exploded from the vast steppes of Central Asia with a speed that stunned the medieval world. But its origins are deeply tied to the rhythms of the grassland itself. For centuries, the tribes had been divided, locked in their own petty feuds. Then the climate shifted. Paleoclimatological evidence from tree rings and lake sediments suggests the steppe experienced a period of unusually wet and mild weather during the late 12th century. This was a golden age for the grassland. Lush, abundant pastures supported enormous herds of horses, sheep, and goats. More livestock meant more wealth and, crucially, more food. This agricultural surplus fueled a population boom among the nomadic tribes. More people and more horses meant greater military potential, but it also created a profound vulnerability. The entire society became calibrated to this new, richer normal. Then the good times ended. The climate snapped back to its harsh, arid baseline. A severe drought gripped the steppe at the turn of the 13th century. The lush grasses withered and the land began to crack. The wind whipped across the barren ground, lifting the dry soil into great, suffocating dust storms. How do you sustain a population that has expanded during a time of plenty when the land can no longer support it? The tribes faced a stark choice: starve where they stood or unite and look outward for survival. This environmental pressure created the perfect conditions for a unifier. A young chieftain named Temujin, who would become Genghis Khan, emerged from this crisis. He understood that internal warfare was a luxury they could no longer afford. He channeled the desperate energy of the starving tribes outward, promising them wealth and sustenance from the settled civilizations beyond the steppe. Their legendary mobility, born from a life on horseback, became their weapon. But the Mongols were not just a product of the dust, they became an agent of it. Their invasions were shockingly destructive to the fragile agricultural systems of the lands they conquered. In Persia and Central Asia, they systematically destroyed the intricate networks of underground canals known as khanats that sustained oasis cities. Without these ancient irrigation systems, fertile fields quickly reverted to desert. The soil, no longer watered and anchored by crops, dried out and blew away, creating localized dust bowls of their own making. The empire that was forged by drought ultimately spread it, leaving a legacy of environmental scars across continents alongside its unprecedented conquests. The silent stone cities of the American Southwest hold the ghost of a civilization that simply walked away. High on the mesas and tucked into sheer cliff faces, the ancestral pueblones, often called the Anasazi, built intricate multi-story dwellings that seemed to defy gravity itself. Places like Mesa Verde's Cliff Palace were marvels of urban planning, housing hundreds of people in a complex of stone rooms and kivas. Yet by the turn of the 14th century, every one of these magnificent dwellings was empty. The key to their exodus is not found in weapons or signs of war, but in the rings of ancient trees. The science of dendrochronology provides a stunningly precise calendar of catastrophe. The tree rings from that era are shockingly narrow, indicating a period of extreme aridity now known as the Great Drought, a dry spell that gripped the region for nearly 25 years. Think of the lifeblood of this civilization, the seasonal springs and the ephemeral rivers that carved the canyons. Under a relentless sun that lasted for a generation, these water sources would have vanished completely. The canyon floors, once fertile enough to support fields of maize, beans, and squash, would have hardened into barren, cracked earth. The wind would have swept through the empty riverbeds, lifting the fine, dry soil into swirling clouds of dust that settled over the abandoned stone granaries. How do you sustain a concentrated population in a cliffside apartment complex when the water holes at the bottom of the canyon have turned to dust and the fields yield only withered stalks? The social and spiritual structures that held their society together, centered on community and a deep connection to the land, were stretched to the breaking point. There is archaeological evidence of rising conflict, perhaps desperate raids for the last remaining resources. But the ultimate response was not war, it was migration. The people made a collective, pragmatic decision to leave their magnificent stone cities behind. They did not vanish. They migrated south and east, joining existing communities and forming new pueblos along rivers with more reliable water, like the Rio Grande. Their exodus was not an end, but a strategic retreat from a land that could no longer sustain them. A story of resilience written not in stone, but in the dust they left behind. Even the Sahara Desert once nurtured a mighty empire. In the heart of what is now the desolate Libyan desert, the Garamantian civilization carved out a kingdom of green oases and bustling towns. Their power was built on a hidden treasure, fossil water. This was not rainwater from a recent storm, but ancient groundwater, trapped deep beneath the sand for thousands of years, a non-renewable inheritance from a wetter climatic age. To reach this liquid life, the Garamantes engineered a masterwork of hydraulic ingenuity, a sprawling network of underground tunnels known as fagaras. These were not simple wells, they were gently sloping tunnels dug deep into the ground, often for miles, to tap into the water table and guide it by gravity to the surface. This system transformed their capital, Garama, into a vibrant hub of agriculture and trade, a green jewel in a sea of sand. For centuries they flourished, their caravans crossing the desert while their fields prospered. But their success contained the seeds of its own destruction. They were living on water savings, not water income. With each passing year, they drew more from their ancient aquifers than could ever be replenished. The water table began a slow, irreversible decline. At the same time, the climate of the Sahara continued its long, natural trend toward greater aridity. The combination was fatal. The fagaras, once gushing with life, began to run dry. Maintaining these vast subterranean tunnels against collapsing sand became a losing battle. As the water vanished, the green fields shriveled. The dry, exposed soil had no defense against the desert winds. Great dust storms, which the land had once resisted, now swept across the abandoned farms. They buried the mouths of the fagaras under immense dunes, sealing them forever. The civilization did not fall to an invader's sword. It was slowly, inexorably suffocated. The towns were gradually abandoned, their people dispersing as the desert reclaimed its own. The Garamantes left behind a silent, sobering lesson, a warning written in sand and dust about the ultimate cost of building a civilization on a resource that cannot last. A kingdom's wealth can be measured in the red earth beneath its feet. In the highlands of Ethiopia, the kingdom of Aksum grew fabulously rich, its power stretching across the Red Sea. This was no isolated outpost. It was a commercial titan trading gold, ivory, and exotic goods with Rome, Persia, and India. Giant, intricately carved stelae, some over 100 feet tall, pierced the sky above its capital, monuments to kings who commanded both land and sea. This magnificent prosperity was built on a foundation of fertile volcanic soil. The highland plains, watered by reliable rains, produced immense surpluses of grain that fed the cities and fueled the trade caravans. But the very engines of this wealth would eventually strip the land bare. To maintain its military and produce goods for trade, Axum developed a massive iron industry. Smelting the ore required enormous quantities of charcoal, and that meant deforestation on a staggering scale. The lush forests that once carpeted the highlands were systematically cut down. At the same time, to feed a growing population, farmers pushed their fields to the limit, planting season after season without rest. They were mining the soil itself, extracting its nutrients faster than they could be replenished. The consequences were slow but irreversible. Without the deep roots of trees to hold the earth in place, the rich red topsoil began to wash away with every heavy rain. The same rains that once brought life now carved deep gullies through the denuded landscape, carrying the kingdom's fertile soul down to the rivers and out to sea. What was left behind was a hard, dusty, and exhausted land, its vitality blown away on the wind. How do you sustain an empire when your fields will no longer yield a harvest? The answer is you cannot. The agricultural surplus that was the true source of Axum's power evaporated. Famine and economic decline weakened the central authority. The kingdom lost its grip on the lucrative Red Sea trade routes, its influence shrinking back to the highlands. The great stelae still stood, but they now overlooked a kingdom that was slowly, inexorably, starving to death on its own barren ground. The silence that fell over Axum was not the result of an invasion, but the quiet, final act of an empire that had consumed the very land that gave it life. While the Mycenaean citadels were burning, another great power was facing its own silent enemy. The Hittite Empire, a rival to Egypt and a master of Anatolia, commanded its domain from the formidable, walled capital of Hattusa. This was a city of cyclopean stone walls and massive gateways guarded by stone lions and sphinxes, a seemingly impregnable fortress. Yet around 1200 before the Common Era, Hattusa was not sacked but peacefully, mysteriously abandoned. The Royal Archives, a library of thousands of clay tablets detailing laws, treaties, and royal decrees, were left neatly in place as if the entire government simply walked away and never returned. For a long time, this was one of history's great puzzles. Why would an empire abandon its heart? The answer lies not in the ruins of the city, but in the silent archives of nature. Scientists studying the growth rings of ancient juniper trees from Anatolia have uncovered a devastating secret. These rings tell the story of a sudden, catastrophic event, a severe and unrelenting drought that gripped the central plateau for 3 consecutive years. 3 years may not sound like a long time, but on the arid Anatolian plateau, where agriculture was always a delicate gamble, it was a death sentence. The grain harvests, the caloric foundation of the entire empire, would have failed completely. The imperial granaries, which were meant to see the population through a single lean season, would have been emptied within the first year. By the second year, famine would have been widespread. By the third year, the social contract that bound the outlying provinces to the capital would have dissolved into dust. How do you maintain the loyalty of your army and your subjects when you cannot feed them? The authority of the great king in Hattusa, once absolute, would have evaporated as quickly as the last puddle of water in a dry riverbed. This internal collapse, born from hunger and desperation, left the Hittite state critically vulnerable. It coincided perfectly with the wider chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse, a time when mysterious sea peoples were raiding coastlines and entire trade networks were disintegrating. The Hittites, crippled by their own environmental crisis, had no resilience left to withstand these external shocks. They likely fractured from within, with provinces rebelling against a central authority that could no longer provide security or sustenance. The abandonment of Hattusa was not an act of conquest, but a final, pragmatic admission of defeat. The empire did not fall to a superior army at its gates. It was starved into oblivion by a drought, leaving its magnificent capital to be reclaimed by the silent, waiting earth. The Moche people performed a miracle of engineering on the sun-baked coast of Peru. They turned one of the driest deserts on earth into a lush green valley. Their secret was a web of irrigation canals that channeled water from the rivers flowing down from the Andes, allowing them to cultivate vast fields of maize, beans, and squash. Their capital was dominated by two colossal adobe pyramids, the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca de la Luna, which stood as towering symbols of their power and their gods. This was a sophisticated society of master artisans and warriors, a civilization perfectly adapted to its arid home. Then the ocean itself turned against them. Deep-sea sediment cores and geological evidence from the region tell a story of a climatic monster, a mega El Niño event of staggering power. For 30 years, the Pacific Ocean released a torrent of heat and moisture into the atmosphere. The predictable desert climate shattered. The skies, which had been reliably clear for generations, opened up and did not close. The rain fell in biblical proportions, not for days, but for years. The gentle rivers they relied upon swelled into raging, muddy torrents. Their masterpiece of irrigation became an instrument of their own destruction. The canals, designed for a trickle of water, were utterly overwhelmed. They burst their banks, sending walls of water and liquefied mud crashing across the landscape. The adobe bricks of their cities and temples, dried for centuries in the sun, were no match for this deluge. Entire neighborhoods of their capital simply dissolved, melting back into the earth from which they were made. The Huaca del Sol, the larger of the two great pyramids, had a third of its mass washed away in a single, catastrophic event. Just as the society was reeling from this decades-long flood, the pendulum swung to the opposite, equally terrifying extreme. The rain stopped and a profound drought descended. This was not a return to the familiar dry climate they were built for. It was a harsh, prolonged desiccation. The landscape, scoured by floods, was now a salted, dusty ruin. The floodwaters had deposited layers of mineral salts onto the fields, poisoning the soil. With no rain to flush the salts away, the earth became sterile. The relentless wind, which once carried only sand, now lifted the fine, alkaline dust from the barren floodplains, creating choking dust storms that settled over the remnants of their cities. How do you rebuild a civilization when your farmland has turned to toxic dust and your water system lies in ruins? The answer is a descent into chaos. The political and religious authority of the Moche lords, who had promised to control the forces of nature, evaporated. Their power, derived from their ability to provide abundance, was now a hollow joke. The archaeological record shows a grim transition. The later layers at Moche sites are not filled with beautiful pottery and gold ornaments. They are filled with crude fortifications, mass graves, and skeletons bearing the marks of violent trauma. Society fractured into warring factions, fighting over the few patches of land that could still sustain life. The Moche did not simply fade away. They tore themselves apart in a desperate struggle for survival, their world ending not with a single cataclysm, but in a slow, agonizing collapse, first by water and then by dust. That white crust on the fields was a slow, invisible poison. Long before the Akkadians built their empire, the Sumerians had performed a miracle in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They invented civilization itself, and at the heart of their genius was water. They engineered the world's first sophisticated irrigation networks, a sprawling web of canals that diverted river water to their arid plains, transforming a desert into the Fertile Crescent. This was the engine of their wealth, allowing them to build the magnificent ziggurats of Ur and the powerful city-state of Lagash. For centuries, their agricultural surplus funded art, architecture, and armies. But their brilliant solution contained a fatal chemical flaw. In a hot, dry climate like Mesopotamia, water is constantly evaporating. When the Sumerians flooded their fields, the water would evaporate quickly under the relentless sun, but the minerals dissolved within it, primarily salt, were left behind. With no natural drainage to flush these salts away, they accumulated in the soil, season after season, year after year. A white, crystalline crust began to form on the surface, a glittering, deadly warning. This process, called salinization, is a quiet apocalypse. The salt slowly poisons the land, making it impossible for most crops to absorb water and nutrients. The Sumerians themselves left us a heartbreaking record of this decline. Ancient clay tablets from the city of Lagash meticulously document crop yields. In earlier centuries, the records boast of fields producing vast amounts of wheat, but over time, a grim pattern emerges. The wheat, a salt-sensitive crop, begins to disappear from the records entirely. It is replaced by the more salt-tolerant barley. Even then, the yields tell a story of desperation. A tablet from around 2,400 years before the Common Era might record a yield of 2,400 liters of barley per field. Just a few centuries later, that same field produces only 1,000 liters. The land was dying beneath their feet. How do you maintain a temple economy or feed a standing army when your harvests are cut in half? The answer is a slow, grinding collapse. The city-states, weakened by this agricultural crisis, became vulnerable to internal strife and external conquest. The glorious city of Ur, once the capital of an empire, saw its influence wane as its fields turned to barren, dusty plains. The very innovation that had given birth to Sumerian civilization, its intricate canals, became the instrument of its long, slow suffocation. Their story is a profound and ancient lesson, a reminder that the greatest threats are not always armies at the gate, but sometimes the silent, accumulating consequences of our own survival. Deep within a desert canyon, a city of rose-red stone was carved not just from rock, but from a profound understanding of water. The Nabateans performed a miracle of survival in one of the world's most arid regions. Their capital, Petra, was not an oasis in the traditional sense. It was a masterpiece of hydrological engineering. They did not rely on a single river or spring. Instead, they became masters of harvesting the desert's most fleeting resource, the sudden, violent downpours that could flash through the wadis. Their entire empire was a vast, intricate spiderweb designed to catch every drop. They constructed massive dams to divert floodwaters, carved countless cisterns into the solid rock to store it, and chiseled channels and pipelines to guide it to their fields and fountains. This system allowed them to support a population of perhaps 30,000 people in the heart of the desert, and more importantly, it gave them absolute control over the lucrative incense route. Caravans carrying frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia had no choice but to pass through the canyons they commanded, paying heavy taxes for the privilege of drinking Nabatean water. Their wealth and power were built not on gold but on captured rainfall. But what happens when the rains stop coming for a generation? The very sophistication of their system became its greatest vulnerability. It was calibrated to capture and store a certain amount of annual rainfall, a delicate balance perfected over centuries. Paleoclimate data from nearby caves suggests that around the 1st century of the Common Era, the region was struck by a mega-drought, a climatic shift that lasted for decades. The brief, intense storms that their dams and cisterns were designed to capture simply ceased. The hidden water sources they relied on, the secret springs and the groundwater that fed their deepest wells, began a slow, irreversible retreat. Their vast network of cisterns, the heart of their defensive strategy against the desert, stood empty, baking in the sun. The reservoirs that once reflected the magnificent carved facades of their tombs became nothing more than deep, dusty bowls. The wind, which once carried the scent of water and trade, now whipped through the canyon, lifting the dry, exposed sediment from the empty riverbeds. The desert, which they had held at bay for so long, began its final, creeping advance. The lifeblood of their trade empire evaporated. Without a reliable water supply, they could no longer provision the great caravans. The merchants began to seek other routes, bypassing the kingdom that could no longer guarantee their survival. The wealth that had paid for the maintenance of their incredible waterworks dried up, and with it, the will to fight the desert faded. Petra was not conquered by a foreign army. It was slowly, patiently reclaimed by the dust it had so brilliantly defied, its rose-red facades becoming a beautiful, silent monument to a civilization that ultimately lost its long war with a changing sky. The Byzantine Empire found its new heart beating not in Rome, but in the Anatolian plateau. After losing the wealthy provinces of Egypt and Syria to Arab conquests in the 7th century, this vast, high-altitude land became the empire's final stronghold, its breadbasket and its main source of soldiers. The fate of Constantinople now rested entirely on the harvests of Anatolia, and then the land itself began to fail. Tree rings and lake sediments from the region tell a stark story of the 7th and 8th centuries, a period marked by relentless drought and punishing temperature swings. The predictable rains that watered the grain fields grew scarce. The soil, baked hard under a merciless sun, began to crack and crumble into dust. This environmental collapse was not entirely natural. To support its armies and its shrunken population, the empire pushed its remaining lands to the limit. Widespread overgrazing by imperial herds and the clearing of forests for fuel and farmland stripped the landscape of its protective cover. Without the deep roots of grasses and trees to hold the earth together, the topsoil had no defense. Every dry wind scoured the plains, lifting the fertile soil into great, suffocating clouds that drifted eastward, leaving behind a sterile, stony ground. How does an empire feed its legendary armies, the Tagmata and Themata, that stood as the last bulwark against Islam when its granaries are empty? The answer is a slow, grinding retreat. The Byzantine state was caught in a vicious cycle. Dust Bowl conditions in Anatolia led to poor harvests and famine. This meant fewer taxes collected and less grain to pay and provision the very soldiers needed to defend the Anatolian frontier from persistent Arab raids. A malnourished and underfunded army could not hold the line. Arab armies operating from their new bases in Syria found a weakened and retreating enemy. They launched deep raids into the heart of Anatolia, not to conquer and hold the dusty land, but to systematically destroy what little remained. They burned fields, sabotaged irrigation systems, and captured populations, ensuring the land could not recover. Each raid pushed the Byzantine frontier further west, shrinking the empire's resource base even more. The empire was trapped, strangled by the dust of its own heartland. It could not muster the strength for a decisive counter-offensive to reclaim Egypt or Syria because it was perpetually struggling to feed itself. The once great Eastern Roman Empire was reduced to a beleaguered rump state, not just by the swords of its enemies, but by the silent, creeping advance of dust across the Anatolian plains, a slow-motion disaster that crippled its power for centuries. Gold and salt built an empire in the heart of the Sahara. The Ghana Empire, reaching its peak centuries before Mali would rise, was a legendary kingdom whose wealth was proverbial. Arab scholars wrote of a court where the king commanded an army of 200,000 warriors, a power funded by its absolute control over the trans-Saharan trade routes. Caravans of thousands of camels, the ships of the desert, carried precious salt from the northern mines south and gold from the southern forests north, all meeting in the markets of Ghana, where the empire taxed every ounce. Yet this commercial powerhouse rested on a foundation just as vital as gold, the fertile agricultural heartland of the Sonic people. This was a land of grains and sustenance, feeding the cities and garrisons that protected the trade. But the desert is never static. For centuries, the Sahara had been on a slow, relentless southern march, a process of desertification amplified by natural climate cycles. Though wells along the established trade routes, the lifelines for the great caravans, began to require deeper digging. The seasonal winds, known as the harmattan, began to carry more dust and for longer periods. These dust storms did not just darken the sky for a day, they deposited a fine, sterile layer over the farmlands on the empire's vulnerable northern fringe. Each storm subtly degraded the soil, choking young plants and slowly reducing the land's fertility. How do you maintain an army when your own grain reserves are under threat from the very air you breathe? The empire found itself fighting a war on two fronts, one against the rising ambition of neighboring states, and a far more insidious one against the creeping dust. Maintaining the trade routes became exponentially more difficult and expensive as reliable water sources dried up and pastures for the camels vanished. The cost of empire was rising just as its agricultural base was slowly being scoured away. This long, slow pressure did not cause a dramatic collapse, but it critically weakened the structure. When a dynamic new power, the Mali Empire, began to rise to the south, Ghana was already brittle, its wealth and vitality slowly being siphoned away by the encroaching sands. The empire did not so much fall as it was absorbed, its legacy and a great deal of its wealth passing to the successors who would build their own cities of gold further south, in lands not yet touched by the desert's breath. Those silent wooden tablets hold a story of a world that consumed itself. On the remote island of Rapa Nui, a society achieved something magnificent, carving and raising nearly 900 massive stone moai, those iconic statues that gaze eternally inland. But their greatest cultural achievement became the direct cause of their ecological ruin. To move these multi-ton giants from the quarry to their coastal platforms, the islanders needed a vast supply of strong timber for rollers, levers, and sledges. They began to cut down the island's lush palm forests, a resource that seemed endless. But on a small, isolated island, nothing is endless. With each new statue raised, another swath of forest vanished forever. The consequences were as brutal as they were predictable. Without the deep, anchoring roots of the trees, the thin, fertile topsoil had no defense against the relentless wind and rain. The land began to bleed into the sea. Every storm washed more precious soil from the hillsides, leaving behind a scarred and barren landscape. The rich earth that had once supported extensive farms was carried away on the wind as dust or washed into the ocean, leaving only bare rock and sterile clay. The island, once a verdant paradise, was transforming into a windswept, dusty plain. This self-inflicted dust bowl triggered a horrifying chain reaction. Without trees, they could no longer build the sturdy seafaring canoes necessary for deep water fishing, cutting off a vital protein source. The eroded soil could no longer support the large population's gardens. Famine gripped the island. How do you sustain a society built on monumental ambition when you can no longer feed your people? The answer is a descent into chaos. The same communal spirit that erected the moai shattered. Society fractured into warring clans, and the archaeological record turns grim. Caves become fortified refuges, and the most chilling discovery of all appears: obsidian spear points littering the landscape, tools with a name that tells you everything: Mata. The very statues that were meant to channel ancestral power became targets of violence themselves, toppled by rival groups in an orgy of cultural suicide. The civilization that had mastered stone was ultimately defeated by the dust that blew from its own barren fields, a stark and sobering lesson in a world with nowhere left to run. The Norse farms of Greenland were a stubborn piece of Scandinavia transplanted onto the edge of the known world. For centuries, the settlers maintained their European way of life, raising cattle and sheep in verdant fjords, their stone churches echoing with familiar prayers. They clung to a pastoral identity, measuring their wealth and status in the size of their herds and the butter they could produce, but the world around them was changing. The relatively mild climate that had welcomed them was withdrawing, ushering in the long, bitter centuries of the Little Ice Age. The growing seasons shrank with each passing year. The sea, their connection to trade and rescue, began to choke with impenetrable pack ice, isolating them from Iceland and Norway. The once green pastures, overgrazed and starved of warmth, could no longer regenerate. The thin soil, exposed by the dying grass, simply blew away on the Arctic winds, leaving behind only gravel and dust-covered rock. Their cattle grew thin and died, and the settlers faced a slow, creeping starvation huddled inside their longhouses. Yet, in that same unforgiving landscape, the Inuit people not only survived, they thrived. Their world was one of sealskin kayaks and harpoons, of mobility and a deep knowledge of the sea ice the Norse saw only as a barrier. While the Norse starved waiting for a ship that could no longer reach them, the Inuit hunted seal and walrus, their culture perfectly adapted to the very conditions that were killing their neighbors. The Norse colony's end was not sudden. It was a quiet, generations-long failure to adapt, a refusal to learn from the people who understood the land. They died, in the end, not from a single catastrophe, but from a kind of cultural paralysis, buried by the cold and the dust of their own fading fields. The same climatic chaos that strangled Angkor did not stop at its borders. To the east, the Kingdom of Champa thrived along the central coast of Vietnam, a maritime power whose culture was a vibrant tapestry of Hindu and indigenous traditions. Their world was one of bustling port cities and fertile river valleys, a civilization built on trade and rice. And to Champa's north lay the Dai Viet, a fiercely independent kingdom forged in its long resistance to Chinese domination, a society of disciplined farmers and soldiers rooted in the Red River Delta. These three powers, the Khmer, the Champa, and the Dai Viet, were locked in a complex dance of trade, diplomacy, and warfare for centuries. But when the monsoons turned against them all, that dance became a desperate fight for survival. The same tree rings that reveal Angkor's drought also tell of punishing dry spells and catastrophic floods hammering the entire Southeast Asian mainland. For the Champa, whose narrow coastal realm was especially vulnerable, a failed monsoon meant their rivers ran low and their rice paddies cracked under the sun. For the Dai Viet in the north, it meant the Red River itself could become a trickle or a raging, silt-laden torrent. When the rains did come, they often arrived with such ferocity that they scoured the hillsides, washing precious topsoil down to the sea and leaving behind dusty, barren slopes. This shared environmental crisis turned regional rivalries into a brutal, zero-sum game. A drought in one kingdom was no longer just its own problem, it was a potential opportunity for a neighbor. As agricultural land failed and dust gathered on fallow fields, the pressure to secure new, reliable resources became overwhelming. The wars between these states intensified, no longer just about prestige or territory, but about the fundamental necessities of water and food. The Dai Viet, with their larger population base and a more resilient administrative structure, began to push southward. They were not just conquering for glory, they were expanding to capture the fertile coastal plains that could feed their people. The Champa kingdom, squeezed between the failing monsoons and the advancing Dai Viet armies, found itself in an impossible position. Their own resource base was shrinking just as their northern rival was growing more desperate and powerful. The conquest was not swift, but it was inexorable. Over centuries, the Dai Viet slowly absorbed the Champa territories, their southward march a direct response to the environmental pressures that plagued the entire region. The fall of Champa was not merely a military defeat, it was a dramatic reshaping of Southeast Asia's political map, a realignment forced by a climate that could no longer support the old balance of power. The dust that settled over abandoned Cham temples was the same dust that had blown across the silt-choked reservoirs of Angkor, a silent testament to how a changing sky can redraw the boundaries of empires. The sulfuric acid spike found in Greenland's ice cores tells a planetary story. These frozen layers, pinpointed to the middle of the 17th century before the Common Era, capture the very moment Thura's plume of ash and gas reached the stratosphere circling the globe. This was not a local dust storm, but a planetary shroud. Sulfate aerosols from the eruption formed a microscopic veil around the Earth, reflecting sunlight back into space and plunging the entire planet into a volcanic winter that lasted for years. Imagine the growing season suddenly vanishing. In regions as far removed as the Yellow River Valley, unseasonable frosts would have blackened millet stalks in the field. In the highlands of Peru, early cultures dependent on delicate mountain crops would have watched their harvests fail under a strangely cold sun. The disruption to global weather patterns was absolute. Monsoons could have faltered in India, and rain belts might have shifted unpredictably over the Americas. Even without total desertification, these conditions created miniature dust bowl crises everywhere. The dry, cold winds would have scoured any unprotected soil, lifting dust from fields that could no longer hold their ground. A single geological event on a Mediterranean island thus became a global trigger. It was a stark demonstration of how interconnected our world has always been, where the explosion of one volcano could send silent, hungry repercussions echoing through the fledgling empires of every continent. The dust of 30 fallen empires settles into a single, sobering pattern. Time and again, the mightiest kingdoms were not defeated by a superior army, but by the slow, silent decay of their own foundation, the very ground beneath their feet. The story of civilization is, in the end, a story of soil. The Akkadians and the Maya, the Romans and the Khmer, all shared fatal flaws that read like a modern-day cautionary tale. They placed absolute faith in a single, fragile agricultural system, whether it was the wheat fields of Mesopotamia or the maize fields of Cahokia. When that system failed under the pressure of drought or poor management, the entire imperial structure had no backup plan. They engaged in catastrophic deforestation, stripping the land of the very anchor that held it together, as the Mauryaans and the Rapa Nui Islanders discovered to their ultimate cost. They engineered brilliant water management systems, only to become prisoners of their own ingenuity, like the Nabateans and the Sumerians, whose canals brought both life and a slow chemical death. And when the climate shifted, as it always does, they proved unable or unwilling to adapt their core identity, a lesson written in the frozen dust of the Norse Greenlanders. These are not isolated historical curiosities, they are a template. Look at the modern tragedy of the Aral Sea, once the world's fourth largest lake, now a ghostly basin of salt and dust after its feeder rivers were diverted for cotton farming. This was not an act of nature, but a deliberate policy that created a brand new dust bowl in a single generation, mirroring the self-inflicted wounds of the Garamantes and the Moche. Today, we face our own version of the long drought, a global climate crisis driven by our own actions, threatening the breadbaskets that feed billions. The same forces that toppled empires are now operating on a planetary scale. Our globalized world is the ultimate empire, deeply interconnected and terrifyingly vulnerable to the same pressures. The choice our ancestors never had is the one we still possess. We can read the warning written in 30 layers of ancient dust, or we can become the 31st chapter in that relentless story. The fate of empires has always been decided by their relationship with the earth, and our own chapter is still being written. This epic journey ends where it began, with the dust settling over the ruins of forgotten empires. 30 times we have watched this story unfold, a relentless cycle of rise and fall where the true enemy was rarely an army, but the silent, creeping decay of the land itself. These were not random acts of a vengeful god, but the predictable outcome of a dangerous dance between a changing climate and human ambition. Each civilization, from Akkad to Anka, made a series of choices, clearing forests, overworking the soil, and building complex systems that created a profound fragility. When the inevitable drought came or the rains failed, their world did not bend, it shattered. The true lesson of these 30 dust bowls is not that our ancestors were foolish, but that they were human, grappling with forces they could not fully comprehend. We stand in a unique position, armed with their entire history. We can see the patterns they could not, the fatal dependencies, and the ecological oversights that led to their undoing. Our modern global civilization is the ultimate empire, a network of incredible complexity that is just as vulnerable to the same pressures. The choice our ancestors never had is the one we hold right now. We can read the warning written in 30 layers of ancient dust, or we can become the 31st chapter in that tragic story. The fate of every empire is decided by its relationship with the earth. Let us learn from their silence. We would love to hear which of these ancient collapses you find most haunting. Was it the mysterious Hittites, the mighty Romans, or the ingenious Khmer? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys into the deepest mysteries of our past.